Under a real federal law still on the books today, it is completely legal for a thrift store to pay a worker 22 cents an hour. Not $22, 22 cents. The nonprofit that has used this exact provision more than almost any other organization in America brings in $5.6 billion a year and pays some of its regional executive salaries north of $700,000. Same industry, same donated inventory. Two completely different realities depending on which side of the counter you're standing on. Okay, so you want to own a thrift store, racks of secondhand clothes, a steady stream of donations arriving at the back door for free, budget-conscious shoppers hunting for a hidden gem, a feel-good business that helps the community while it makes you money. Here's what that picture doesn't show you. Inventory that costs you nothing to acquire, but can eat 10 to 30% of your entire revenue just to sort, clean, and price it before it's ever sellable. A break-even point that typically takes 12 to 24 months to reach, longer than almost any other small retail business we've covered. And a legal loophole, still active today, that the largest players in this exact industry have used to build empires while paying some of their most vulnerable workers next to nothing. Owning a thrift store looks like one of the simplest, most feel-good small businesses in America. Underneath that feeling is one of the most quietly complicated labor and profit stories in all of retail. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why and what it actually takes to build a version of this business you can be proud of. Before the numbers, let's define what we're talking about. Because thrift store covers a genuinely wide range of business models with very different economics. There's the independent local thrift shop, privately owned, for profit, and typically the smallest and most personal version of this business. There's the nonprofit thrift chain, Goodwill and the Salvation Army being the two names everyone recognizes, technically structured as charities but operating retail networks worth billions of dollars combined. There's the publicly traded for-profit resale chain, companies like Savers, which operate on essentially the same donation-based inventory model as the nonprofits, but as a genuine for-profit corporation, paying corporate taxes and answering to shareholders. And there's the newer online-first resale model, curated vintage sellers operating through apps and marketplaces rather than physical storefronts, a smaller footprint, higher margin per item version of the same basic idea. This script focuses primarily on the independent, for-profit local thrift store, the version most first-time owners actually build, while pulling real numbers from the nonprofit giants because that's where this industry's most uncomfortable financial story actually lives. The startup cost, and the range that depends entirely on how ambitious you get. A lean, straightforward thrift store can launch for somewhere between $20,000 and $150,000 in initial capital. A more fully built-out operation, one with a real point of sale and inventory management system, a delivery van for donation pickups, and proper fit-out for a real retail space, commonly requires closer to $400,000 once you include working capital, the cash reserve you need on hand to survive the months before the business turns a real profit. And that number matters more in this business than almost any other we've covered, because industry data consistently shows thrift stores taking 12 to 24 months to reach break-even, a considerably longer runway than a bike shop or a driving range, precisely because building a reliable donation pipeline and a loyal, price-sensitive customer base both take real time to establish from a standing start. The inventory problem. And here's the detail that surprises almost every first-time owner. Your merchandise arrives at your door for free. That part is genuinely true. But free inventory is not the same thing as free profit, because every single donated item has to be sorted, inspected, cleaned, tagged, and priced before it's sellable. And that processing labor typically consumes 10 to 30% of your total revenue on its own. A donated coat that cost you nothing to acquire still costs you real employee time to steam, inspect for damage, price appropriately, and hang on the floor. Miscalculate this cost, and a business that looks like it has a $0 cost of goods sold on paper can quietly bleed cash through labor costs that never show up as a line item most first-time owners think to budget for. Layer on top of that your standard retail overhead. Rent typically running 15 to 25% of revenue. Wages for your sales floor staff another 30 to 40%, and marketing at 10 to 15%, and total overhead commonly consumes 50 to 70% of everything you bring in the door. The revenue model and building a realistic picture. A typical thrift store in North America generates around $300,000 in annual revenue, though that number varies enormously by size and location, with urban stores commonly earning 2 to 3 times what a comparable rural location brings in. A smaller operation typically needs somewhere between $9,000 and $15,000 in monthly sales just to function, while a healthier, better-positioned store often needs $20,000 to $35,000 a month to comfortably clear its overhead and turn a real profit, requiring roughly 900 to 1,000 paying customers walking through the door every single month. Gross margins, thanks to that near zero cost of goods, run a genuinely strong 40 to 60%. But after processing labor, rent, staffing, and marketing all take their share, net profit margins for a well-run independent store typically land somewhere between 5 and 15%, with the best-managed urban locations occasionally reaching into the 20 to 30% range. Let's build a realistic scenario. A modestly successful independent store generating $25,000 a month in sales, $300,000 a year, at a healthy 50% gross margin, produces $150,000 in gross profit. Subtract processing labor at roughly 20% of revenue, $60,000, plus rent, staffing, and marketing consuming another 55%, $165,000, and you're left with a genuinely thin net profit of roughly negative $15,000 in a rough year, or in a well-optimized version of the exact same store. A real net profit closer to $30,000 to $45,000 a year once processing efficiency and pricing discipline improve. The gap between those two outcomes, in a business with theoretically free inventory, comes down almost entirely to operational discipline. Now here's the part of this industry that most people have genuinely never looked at closely, and it's the story that separates the small, honest, independent operator from the largest players in this exact space. A federal law called Section 14 of the Fair Labor Standards Act allows certain employers to pay workers with disabilities a wage below the federal minimum, calculated through time and motion studies that compare a disabled worker's output to a non-disabled worker doing the same task. Roughly 40,000 workers nationwide, spread across about 800 mostly nonprofit employers, are currently paid under this exact provision, and Goodwill Industries has been documented across multiple regional affiliates and multiple independent investigations, using it more than almost any other organization in the country. Labor Department records have shown Goodwill workers being paid as little as 22 cents, 38 cents, and 41 cents an hour. In one documented case, a regional Goodwill affiliate's average disabled worker wage across the organization ranged as low as 2 cents an hour at one location. This isn't a fringe or hidden practice. It's fully legal, fully disclosed, and has been publicly reported for over a decade. And here's the number that makes it genuinely hard to reconcile. Goodwill Industries International brings in roughly $5.6 billion in annual revenue nationwide, and multiple regional CEOs, including the organization's own former international president, have earned salaries well into 6 and 7 figures, with one reported package reaching $729,000, including deferred compensation. The uncomfortable financial logic underneath this is actually straightforward once you see it. Because the nonprofit structure exempts these organizations from most federal and state taxes, and because their core inventory arrives at effectively zero cost through donations, the primary remaining expense standing between revenue and profit, relabeled at a nonprofit as surplus, is labor. Every dollar shaved off a worker's wage, whether through a minimum wage certificate or otherwise, flows almost directly into that organization's bottom line, funding executive compensation, real estate expansion, and the kind of institutional growth that has made Goodwill one of the largest retail networks in the country, built on a foundation of donated goods and, for a documented share of its workforce, wages measured in cents rather than dollars. So who actually wins in this business long term? And what does that mean for someone starting an honest, independent operation? The nonprofit giants win through structural advantages a small independent owner simply cannot replicate. Tax exemption, a public perception of charitable goodwill that drives donation volume no paid marketing budget could buy. And, for a documented portion of their operations, labor costs that undercut any for-profit competitor by design. The publicly traded for-profit chains, meanwhile, win through sheer operational scale, negotiating bulk processing efficiency and real estate costs no single independent store can match, while at least being required to pay standard wages and corporate taxes like any other retailer. The independent, honestly run local thrift store competing against both of these categories has to win on something neither giant can easily offer: genuine community trust, careful curation that a massive donation processing operation has no incentive to bother with, and a transparent labor practice that, ironically, some shoppers are now actively seeking out as awareness of this exact industry. Story spreads. Let's put real numbers next to two scenarios for our modest independent store. The good year: strong, consistent donation flow, an efficient sorting system that keeps processing costs near the low end of that 10 to 30% range, and steady foot traffic from a loyal local customer base. Annual revenue reaches $360,000. Processing labor runs a lean $54,000, and your remaining overhead, rent, sales staff, and marketing stays controlled at $198,000. Net profit for the year: a genuinely solid $68,000. The bad year, donation quality declines as a new nonprofit competitor opens 2 miles away and captures a meaningful share of your donor base, forcing you to spend more on paid sourcing, estate sale purchases, and liquidation inventory to keep your shelves stocked, adding $18,000 in new acquisition costs you never had to budget for before. Simultaneously, processing labor costs spike to 30% of revenue because donation quality has dropped and your staff is spending more time sorting through unsellable items. Revenue falls to $290,000 as your inventory quality and selection visibly suffer. Processing and new sourcing costs together consume $105,000, and fixed overhead barely moves, still around $190,000. Net result for the year: a loss of roughly $5,000. A business that looked nearly identical to the year before, but got quietly squeezed from both ends. Less free inventory coming in the door, and more cost required to process what little arrived. The swing between those 2 years is $73,000, and in a business built on the premise of free inventory. It came down entirely to something that never appears on a spreadsheet until it's already gone: the reliability of your donation pipeline. So does owning a thrift store make sense? The honest answer is that the underlying model is genuinely sound: low-cost inventory, durable community demand, real margin potential once you've built an efficient operation. But the free inventory, easy profit fantasy badly understates the operational discipline this business actually requires. And it exists in an industry where the largest, most recognizable player has built billions in revenue, partly on the back of a wage practice most people have never heard of, and would likely find genuinely uncomfortable once they had. The independent owners who build something worth being proud of here are the ones who treat processing efficiency as a real operational discipline rather than an afterthought, and who choose, deliberately, to compete on trust and fair labor rather than simply copying the cost structure of the industry's biggest and most controversial players. The dream of the thrift store that helps the community while it helps you is real, and plenty of honest, well-run independent stores build exactly that. The economics underneath the entire industry are more complicated and in places more uncomfortable than the donation bin out front ever lets on. And the owners who build something worth keeping are the ones who understood. Before they open the door, that free inventory always has a real cost somewhere in the chain, and the only real choice they had was deciding who actually paid it.